women in Chinese history. The formidable Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing dynasty. This great palace has been many things. A master plan. A home. A prison. And a diplomatic stage. It has witnessed the highs and lows of an empire. And staged the unveiling of a mysterious nation to the Western world. The story of the Summer Palace reveals secrets that shaped a nation. From characters that shook the world. In the late 19th century, as Europe was well on the road to industrialization, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled China in a way that no one had before. Often from her favorite royal residence on the outskirts of Beijing. It was known as the Summer Palace. But how she came to occupy these opulent walls, whilst taking charge of a nation, is a dramatic story of deceit, pride, power, and tragedy. In 1852, a newly appointed young emperor, Xianfen, had conducted a nationwide search for his royal consorts. One of the young girls that caught his eye that day would later become known as Cixi. She, along with the other recruits, would form Xianfen's harem, living deep within the Forbidden City. But this 16-year-old girl would go on to fight her way to become one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. Cixi was a low-ranking concubine in Xianfen's harem. But things soon changed when she gave birth to his son and heir. She was promoted to noble consort Yi, beginning her ascent to absolute power. With her new title came new privileges, including freedom from the confines of the main royal residence, the Forbidden City. She could now spend time in the Imperial Gardens and the opulent summer retreat known as Yuanming Yuan, on the outskirts of Beijing. But Cixi was soon to be forced to leave her newfound comforts. Following a century of affluence and wealth, China had become a victim of its own success. A strong economy had fueled a population explosion, causing a strain on China's resources. But the biggest threat of all was coming from further afield. Foreign troops were moving in on Beijing, and the royals were forced to flee to safety hundreds of kilometers away. Xianfen's empire was about to enter tumultuous times. On the 18th of October, 1860, the Imperial Gardens were thrown into chaos as a raging inferno took hold. hundreds of buildings were consumed by fire. French and British forces were the culprits of the arson. The blazes went on to destroy almost everything in sight. This was the climax of the famed Second Opium War. For years, China had been trying to ban the drug from entering its ports and to restrict foreign trade and influence. The army had been sent to force Qing rulers to accept the trade of opium from British India and to open more trading ports, increasing international access to China. Beginning in Canton 4 years earlier, the British and French had slowly made their way up China's coast towards the capital. The fires were a final punishment for not complying with demands. War correspondents reported on the events of the one-sided military campaign. Charles Workman of the London Illustrated News describes what he witnessed.
Most striking was the tall pavilion standing high above the garden. It towered on the high stone steps, surrounded by raging flames, and looking like a giant altar in a sea of fire.
Some of the first ever war photographers took pictures of the devastation. The fire claimed most of the buildings.
In the garden, there was nothing left but unbreakable stones. They will remain to tell the people of the future that here had once been a magnificent imperial garden.
The Forbidden City in Beijing's heart was spared. Within the burnt imperial gardens was Emperor Xianfen's greatest loss. His beloved Yuanming Yuan was now decimated. Just 6 days later, when the sky was still thick with smoke, the Qing government were forced to sign the treaty behind the destruction. Britain and France's violent tactics had worked, and Emperor Xianfen was left with no choice but to comply. It would later be known as one of the unequal treaties. Humiliated and furious, Emperor Xianfen refused to return to his capital, even after the Europeans had left. And he died soon afterwards, aged just 30. Following his death, Xianfen's only son was elevated to emperor. He would be known as Emperor Tongzhi. As his mother, Cixi became the Holy Mother Empress Dowager. With Yuanming Yuan and the imperial gardens destroyed, Cixi and the grieving royal family returned to Beijing. Forced to live in the Forbidden City. Far from grief-stricken, Cixi saw her husband's death as the perfect moment to strike a blow to improve China. She launched a coup and successfully overthrew those appointed by the late emperor on his deathbed. The Dowager Empress would now rule China until the new emperor came of age. But her influence would be felt for far longer. When Emperor Tongzhi officially took over the reins in 1873, Cixi continued to assert her power. Palace women could not be seen by officials, so she was concealed by a curtain and ruled from her throne, which sat directly behind her sons. Over the next 5 decades, China's fate would be determined by Cixi. She was the true ruler of China, the first woman to do so for over 800 years. Restricted by life in the Forbidden City, Cixi yearned for the peace and tranquility of the Imperial Gardens and Yuan, which still lay broken and abandoned. Emperor Xianfen's great-grandfather, Emperor Qianlong, had based himself here in the mid-1700s, at a time of great affluence, when China held a quarter of the world's wealth. It had been the preferred home of all the Qing emperors since it was built in 1709. And had effectively been the base of the dynasty. Originally from the plains of northern China, the Qing royal family preferred Yuan's cooler climate and open design compared with the oppressive heat of the Forbidden City. Standing in around 300 hectares and more than 4 times the size of the Forbidden City, Yuan in the Imperial Gardens required a substantial and reliable water supply. Although surrounded by wetlands, there was no way of getting the water to where it was needed. Emperor Qianlong set about solving this problem. He ordered for the largest natural lake in the area to be dredged, deepened, and expanded. It became Beijing's first man-made reservoir, and at 220 hectares, it could now easily supply water directly to the Imperial Gardens and to the growing capital and its surrounding farmland. Qianlong renamed it Kunming Lake. It was just the first step of his master plan. The wheels were in motion for the creation of a new Imperial Garden. Royal decree after royal decree came flooding in from the emperor's offices to further improve the new lakeside. Another imperial palace was emerging. Over the next decade, a royal painter was taken on tours of the empire. The most beautiful scenes were recorded to canvas and were used as inspiration for the new garden design. Building materials and plants were sourced from the far reaches of his empire. The best architects were brought in to create more and more buildings to adorn the new lake. What began life as an irrigation project had grown into something much more ambitious. Despite China's wealth and prosperity at the time, Qianlong was reluctant to unveil the scale of the new garden project. But eventually, in 1764, after 15 years, an elaborate garden palace inspired by scenery from all across the empire was revealed, along with a reason for the royal spending.
I expanded the lake for hydraulic purposes. Such beautiful scenery would be a waste without the ornament of pavilion, terraces, and towers.
But this was more than a garden. It was one man's vision, an embodiment of his entire empire brought together in one place. The destruction of Qianlong's beloved creation during the Opium War in 1860 meant it had stood for less than a century. And Cixi, then a young imperial concubine, had only a brief taste of its opulence before it was reduced to ashes. Three more emperors would hold the throne after Qianlong, before Cixi's son, Emperor Tongzhi, officially took the reins in 1873. One of his first orders as regent was to repair the damaged Yuan palaces in the Imperial Gardens. The Empress Dowager had made no secret of her wishes to restore the summer retreat, and it was obvious that she was the brains behind the idea. With the influence of the Qing dynasty in decline and the nation in a time of austerity, officials convinced Tongzhi against the idea, concerned that the expense would cause public outcry. His reign was weak, and the young emperor would rarely get his way. Instead, he was exploited by Cixi and the court officials as they battled for power. The 18-year-old had effectively ruled China for only 2 years when he died in 1875. Having failed to produce an heir, the mother who had overshadowed Tongzhi's entire regency quickly resumed power. Having risen to power through Xianfeng's rule, Cixi had taken charge of a nation through her son, and she had no intention of stepping aside now. When she named her 4-year-old nephew the new emperor, her intentions were clear. The boy, now known as Emperor Guangxu, would, like Tongzhi, be a puppet through which she would rule China. These were to be her most defining years of ruling from behind the curtain. And her obsession with rebuilding a summer palace was put aside while she concentrated on running an empire. But when Emperor Guangxu turned 18 and officially took over the government, Cixi had some time to begin planning how she would get her summer palaces back. The obvious choice for restoration was Yuan. But it had already been rejected once, thought too expensive to repair. Only the remains of Emperor Qianlong's gardens surrounding Kunming Lake were a contender for the location of a new summer palace. despite the power she now held, a good excuse was needed to justify the expense. Qianlong had used Kunming Lake to drill his navy over 100 years earlier. When the head of the naval forces requested to do the same, Cixi seized the opportunity, negotiating that Navy funds also cover the repair of some of the lakeside buildings. With this, work could finally begin on a plan that had been on her mind for 26 years. Renovations spiraled out of control, all at the expense of the Chinese fleet. Soon, most of the buildings surrounding the lake were being repaired or rebuilt. Including one that would take pride of place. A building being made in Cixi's honor. It would be the crowning glory of the whole restoration. But the costs were escalating, causing a serious drain on the Navy. Undeterred, Cixi kept up the spending to finish the project in time for her 60th birthday celebrations. But in July 1894, war with Japan broke out, and her plans were cancelled. Many Chinese warships were sunk, destroyed, or captured. Just 7 months later, the Navy was completely devastated. And the entire naval office eventually dissolved, leaving China's coastline exposed. The cost of the project was now more than financial. Despite the crisis, Cixi was determined to finish the new palace. In 1895, the finishing touches were made. Built on the charred foundations of Qianlong's gardens, no expense had been spared in creating the new summer palace. Trusted with the fate of a nation and with unquestionable authority, Cixi, like many great rulers, had an ego that knew no bounds. She wanted an occasion to show herself as the great leader she had become. In all the splendor of her new palace. Her 63rd birthday would be this occasion. On the morning of her big day, on the 4th of November, 1897, Cixi began preparations. Her maids and eunuchs were on hand to make sure that she had the perfect start to her day. Cixi took great pride in her appearance and was meticulous in her morning rituals. A silk dress had been crafted especially for the day by almost 500 tailors. be worn with a shawl made with 3,500 giant pearls. This was to be a royal housewarming party of epic proportions. With celebrations lasting for over a week. Reached the pinnacle of her personal power. Following its defeat to Japan, the Qing dynasty was in increasing trouble. Germany, Russia, France, and Britain were settling on Chinese soil and were beginning to carve out slices of Cixi's empire. And there was serious trouble brewing on the domestic front. Cixi's nephew, Emperor Guangxu, was about to assert himself with some sweeping reforms. He sought his aunt's approval, and agreeing with much of what he proposed, she gave her support. Quickly spiraled out of control as Guangxu issued a total of 180 orders for far-reaching modernization in just 103 days. It was too much for Cixi. Action was needed. Emperor Guangxu was placed under house arrest, and his supporters were arrested, exiled, or killed. The emperor was kept close, forced to attend court with Cixi. Imprisoned within his quarters in the Summer Palace. Guangxu was in lockdown, isolated with only his pet rabbits and his eunuchs for company. Just as Guangxu had been pulled safely back into line, Cixi faced a new crisis. The Boxer movement of 1900. Triggered by the increasing foreign influence in China, a peasant uprising swept across the north of the country. The movement had the support of Cixi at first, who also resented the changes foreign influence had enforced on the nation. When the culmination ended in a violent siege of the foreign embassies in Beijing, an international military formed, entering the capital to subdue the rebels. The Empress Dowager was once again in danger. She was forced to flee her home, with memories of the fate of the Imperial Gardens in the last foreign invasion at the front of her mind. Troops occupied Beijing, and Cixi's new summer palace was invaded. Rather than setting fires, the soldiers took up residence without invitation. Russian, British, and Japanese military were stationed in the summer palace for more than a year. And with Chinese defenses disintegrating, many assumed that Cixi's rule would collapse. But they were wrong. She remained in exile for a year, but retained her power over a nation. Wherever she was, became the center of the empire. The Boxers were quickly defeated, but the victorious foreign troops remained in Beijing. Cixi was forced to change tack and began negotiating with the enemy. The foreigners needed to retain stability in China and keep their vital trade routes open. In October 1902, Sarah Conger, her husband, and other foreigners in Beijing received an invitation. They were invited to meet Empress Dowager Cixi in person at the Summer Palace. A formal audience was held. The guests were unsure of what awaited them.
We sincerely felt that this woman sitting solemnly on the throne deserved to be called a queen. Her black eyes were so bright, as if she could read our minds. We were touched by her dignity of behavior and were filled with awe of the environment and involuntarily curtsied.
Her newfound hospitality was both an olive branch and a strategic maneuver. Unable to officially socialize with men, Cixi's efforts were focused on her female visitors, but some left a bad impression.
Some madam's manner was very improper, and they seemed to look down upon Chinese. However, I soon noticed how those self-righteously civilized and educated people indeed were. In my opinion, the Chinese people were far more civilized and decent compared with them.
But Sarah Conger became a good friend to Cixi.
Her manner was thoughtful, serious in every way, and ever mindful of the comfort and pleasure of her guests. Her eyes are bright, keen, watchful that nothing may escape her observation. Her face does not show marks of cruelty or severity. Her voice is low, soft, and attractive. Her touch gentle and kind.
She wanted the rest of the world to see the Empress Dowager as she did, and came up with a plan. She convinced Cixi to sit for a portrait to be displayed in America. Artist Katherine Carr was the first foreigner to be invited to stay at the Summer Palace, to be on hand to paint at any time. In August 1903, the American was carried through the gates of the mysterious palace. To be her home for the next 10 months. Carl was surprised by her first meeting with the Empress Dowager.
I was aware of her coming after a sudden silence. As I turned back, a petite, lovely lady came out, smiling. The Queen's smile completely conquered me, and I could not help kissing her elegant fingers, which was praise from my heart to her unexpected charm.
Few of her own people had ever painted the Empress Dowager at such close range, let alone a woman from the other side of the world.
Everyone stood silently looking at my every single movement. The touch of the charcoal pencil on the canvas sounded like a huge saw sawing wood. But then, fortunately, my interest came up. so I became aware of nothing else except my painting object and my work.
Cixi, in no hurry to complete the portrait, was more interested in showing off the summer palace and entertaining her new guest. And although she sat patiently for Carl for hours at a time, her real interest was in a more modern approach to portraits. Cixi was fascinated with the emerging art of photography from the West and arranged for her picture to be taken all over the grounds of the palace. A huge entourage was used to move her, while the large and unwieldy camera remained stationary. Despite the interruptions, eventually, after 9 months, Carl had completed 4 portraits. But Cixi wasn't sure of the final results, not used to the shading on the face. She instead persuaded Carl to adjust them to show a flatter, more traditional Chinese style. It was this portrait that was sent to America and showed China's great leader in all of her glory. A move, thanks to Sarah Conger and Katherine Carr, which helped to bring Cixi and Imperial China to the attention of the Western world. Although Cixi embraced modernization towards the end of her reign, it was too little, too late. The Qing dynasty was in trouble, and the foreigners had exposed its weakness to all. Unrest was lurking in the shadows. On the 12th of October 1908, the last political engagement of the Qing dynasty was held at the Summer Palace with the British ambassador. Just a week later, Cixi and Emperor Guangxu left the palace, not knowing that they would never return. A month later, in the Forbidden City, the Empress Dowager was planning how she could save her doomed empire from disaster. But her health was failing her. 38-year-old Guangxu was also unwell. He suddenly took a turn for the worse on the 14th of November and died. Incredibly, 74-year-old Cixi died the very next day. Her last royal act was to name another child, 3-year-old Puyi, who would be the last emperor of China. He was to remain in the Forbidden City, and the Summer Palace was left abandoned, its buildings locked up and neglected. Just 3 years later, in 1911, imperial rule in China came to an end. Puyi, as part part of his abdication agreement, was allowed to keep his title of emperor and stay in the Forbidden City. Over the next decade, he would rarely venture from its walls. And although he retained ownership of the Summer Palace, he had never set foot in its grounds. When in 1924, Pu Yi eventually arranged a visit, it exceeded all of his expectations. But his time at the Summer Palace was to be short-lived. Just months later, the new Republic government took ownership of all imperial property. But with little or no money available for the upkeep of their new acquisitions, the palace fell into further disrepair. The future looked bleak for the Summer Palace. The Japanese invasion during World War II took a further toll when troops took up residence in its buildings for 8 years. But in 1949, the fortunes of the palace were turned around when stability was finally restored to the nation. Communist leaders established a new China and prioritized restoring the palace as a vital part of the nation's heritage. Welcoming 10,000 visitors a day. The Summer Palace, a royal obsession. Its overwhelming opulence, symbolic of the almighty power bestowed on those that lived here. A place instrumental in Chinese history. A stage for unbelievable drama and diplomatic events that shaped the world we now know. As visitors today tread the same paths as the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi, the echoes of China's past can still be heard.